Hello everyone, welcome to Embarcadera's Data U conference. My name is Scott Walls. I'm a software consultant manager here at Embarcadero Technologies. And the session today will be on managing database security and compliance. A little bit about me before we get started. I've been with Embarcadero for about 12 years now. Prior to that, I spent time working as a database developer, so I was in the trenches. And in these last 12 years, I've had the opportunity to talk to many customers, and one thing that's consistent, no matter how you slice it, database change management is a key part of every DBA's role and job. And on that, it's important for database developers as well to understand the changes occurring in your database. So today's session, I want to talk a little bit about managing security, how to walk through a process and understanding the security side of things, managing change for compliance. We'll be looking at automation. We'll certainly spend some time with a product demonstration. I want to spend quite a bit of time today working with Change Manager. And I have a bonus for you at the end. So real quick, let's take a look at the agenda. Again, looking at managing security, talking about those roles, permissions, whatnot that are changed during the life cycle of the database. Managing change for compliance, the benefits of automation, looking at that process as well as looking at the product demonstration, and then certainly, as I mentioned, that bonus. So managing security. Certainly one of the things that's key to a DBA is to understand what's going on behind the scenes in your database. Things such as additional users being created. Do you know that when the users are being created, what the users who have been created, what permissions they have, and have they been approved and been through the process? And that's certainly one area that we can detect. Users granted elevated permissions. Now, this is a key area where we find end users or DBA users getting permissions adjusted, elevated. And do you as a DBA know that? And do you understand when that's occurred? And then how can we revert that? If it gets to a situation where that permission's been elevated, we need to bring that back into compliance. We'll talk about that for a while, certainly within the demo as well. And managing compliance. This is, I say compliance, but I'm really talking about database configuration. And when I talk about configuration, I'm mentioning those settings that are at the database level. So here are just a few, and these are a couple that are used by SQL Server. I have one on the next page that's used by Oracle. But the main point being, as these configuration parameters change and are adjusted, do we know what these are, and how do we detect those? And just as important, and we'll go over this when we look at the product, but the ability to set a standard and understand, I have a SQL Server 2012 instance running on a certain version of Windows Server. This configuration should be standard across my entire enterprise. And how can I set that up to be able to roll that out and detect that? And if the changes occur, how do I manage that? And this is certainly something that doesn't get a lot of traction, but I've worked with customers, and I'm sure most of you have probably been in situations where we've stumbled upon a performance problem on the database. And we've tracked down the usual culprits, right? Looking for sessions that are running extended lengths of time, trying to track down any indexes that have been changed, maybe some bad queries that are being sent to the database. Again, lots of things that could affect it, but in reality, in cases that I've been working with customers, a few of them have detected that it came down to configuration changes. And when did those changes occur? Why did they occur? And they had no mechanism to detect those changes. So their database was sitting there changed and started to suffer performance issues, and it was all because of the inability to detect the configuration change that had occurred. So we'll talk about that certainly within the demonstration. Automation benefits, it goes without saying, define once, run often. Right? We want to be able to set it up, set up the job, comparing either using it for security changes or configuration changes, being able to schedule the job, right? Having that job scheduled to run at certain times, either daily, weekly, monthly, however we set it up, but be able to have that set up to run at a scheduled time. And certainly notifications. How important is it when that job's run to get the notification that A, the job successfully completed, but just as important, B, if anything changed, and then be able to detect the change and be able to report on that immediately. So again, with the tool like Change Manager that we'll be looking at today, we have the ability then to look and see what has changed, and then get an attachment on that email giving us the synchronization script needed. So let's go ahead and hop right into the demonstration using DB Change Manager from Embarcadero. So here's our user interface. So as you can see, we support multiple platforms. So out of the box, we're going to support SQL Server, Oracle, DB2 LUW, and then Sybase, ASE. So for this example, I'm going to spend most of my time today working in my Oracle virtual machines. So I'm already connected. So the first thing we want to do is to create a configuration standard. So let's create a new standard. And what we're doing here is we're going to set this up to give a baseline configuration standard. And then once we get this set up, we'll hop over then and look at some security changes and how we can detect that. And then we'll come back around a little bit later and look at how we can utilize this configuration standard. So what I'm going to do here, this is going to be my Oracle VM image standard. All right, we can add notes if we'd like. So at this point, I'm going to drag over my source. Right, I can add multiple if I'd like to. I'm going to leave it at this. I can look at my refinements now. So here's where I can get into this and really understand what we can control and what we can add to the standard. So here we're looking at all of the different configuration parameters. So at this point, we can leave these as is. Right, if we want to look at the Oracle version information, we can bring that over as well. So let's go ahead and we'll save this. And there we have our first standard. Now at any time, I could come back in here and I could unselect the machine. Right. We could save that. And again, if there's any properties that are not applicable to my environment, I simply set those off. I can also then set this to equal a specific value if I'd like. So again, I have parameters here where I can really dial in and set my standard. So that's a quick baseline approach of setting up the standard for configuration, and we'll come back and use that standard later on. But first, let's go ahead and dig in here and let's take a look at the security side of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a schema archive job. So this is going to be my and I'm going to work on one schema, but certainly, well, no, right now let's just look at the entire database. So my notes, again, we can add the notes if we'd like. Here's my schema archive source. Right, so my refinements, I could filter by owner if I'd like. I could look at my server types. So at this point, right, I'm going to focus just on my users. So I'm going to unselect all these. Right, we can look at server types as well. Now again, server types are not important to me right now in this demo. A little bit later on we may use some more of the schema types. So we'll unselect that. And looking down here at tables and dependencies, again, just to show you what we can do, we can certainly use these objects as well as part of our archive. And now at this point we can expand this and see all the users that are in our database. So again, let's look at our options here. We can include the dependencies if we like. We can extract the DDL. We can also look here and see if we can automatically purge any versions at a later date. Notifications, I mentioned about being able to set up that email notifier. So in this example, I could enable the email notifier. Right, put it to maybe my DBA group. And let me understand when I'm going to get some of these values. Attach the logs always or only on an error. I have that flexibility. And when run from, we're in the workbench mode right now, but we also have the ability to run from a command line, hence the scheduling options that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then here's the history. So at this point, we're ready to run. So let's go ahead and let's kick this off. We're going to extract all the users out of the database. we're going to create this. There we go. So we can then hop in and see the different users. So I've got 36 users. At any time, if I'd like to see the DDL needed to create these users, then I can certainly add that now. So again, we'll save this here. Now, if we look at the history, we can see we have version 1. So what I want to do now is I want to hop over and I'm going to start up DBArtisan, our database administration tool, and I'm going to go ahead and log into the database and then be able to make some adjustments to these users. So hold on one second while I get DBArtisan working. So here I am. I have DBArtisan opened up, connected to that same Oracle instance. So let's look at these users now. So here we can look, see the different status. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to go ahead and create a new user, and I think what I'll do is I'll take advantage of DBArtisan's create like to speed this up a bit. So we'll just name this MGIM Data U, and we'll leave everything else the same. Let's put a password. We'll set next. We'll unselect DBA there. We'll go ahead and select finish. And there we have our new user. Now let's go ahead and go over to Scott. Let's look at it. Let's add the role of the DBA role to Scott. So now we have a couple of changes that we've made. We've added a user as well as made some changes to a role on another user. Also, let's look at a system permission for this user as well. So let's grant create any index. Alter the user. Alright, so at this point we have our archive that we can compare to. So what we'll do now is we'll start and set up a schema comparison job. So we'll create a new job. So this is going to be our nightly Oracle VM security compare. Nightly compare the users. So we have an archive for our source. So we're going to specify archive. So there's our name of the archive. So at this point I want to select the specific version. So we're going to select version 1. Now, is our target. Now in this case, if you have standards with the specific users defined, you can certainly target multiples. I'm going to go ahead and target 1, which is my live database, and we'll use the live source here. But again, if I needed to add more targets, I can certainly add as many as I'd want here, and we can compare those. Go to the refinements. Again, we'll see the users here listed that are part of the archive. We'll go to the mapping. Here's our source, the targets, our options. So here our synchronization method. So we default to manual. We can specify automatic if we like as well. If it exists in source only, we're going to create the record, the object. If it exists in the source and target and don't match, we're going to perform an alter. We can also force DB Change Manager to perform an extended alter if needed, where we drop and recreate the objects. If it exists in the target only, we can drop it. Right? It generate any unused statements as well. Now I'm going to exist in target only. I'm going to go ahead and specify that as a drop. We can look at the password differences as well as the object permissions. I'm going to include the object permissions there. Here's the name case and extract the DDL if we'd like to. And again, looking at the notifications, we schedule this at night. We can certainly enable the email notifier. And then we can look at the history. So at this point, we're ready to go. We're going to kick this off, and it's going to start running the compare using that archive as its source, pointing to the live data source. And again, in this case, I'm utilizing a single target with that source being the archive. We look here, and again, I used the archive and I talked about comparing to multiple targets. We can also use a live database as our source to compare to other live databases. So again, a lot of flexibility that DB Change Manager provides. So here is the results. So we can see that it was done with 0 errors. We had a 94% match. So that is what our compare index is 94%. If we want to show the individual results, simply select that option, and here we can see that we have no creates. So I'm going to unselect that so we can filter these out. We have 1 drop, no alters. So here are so here to synchronize these would be to issue a drop user, the GIM data U user. Right? If we look at the source, it's not in our archive, but it's in our target. So again, it's been created, but it's not in our source. Now in this case, it could be an example that we've approved this. This is certainly a known new user, so we can unselect this. Now let's look here at the Scott. So the script would be to revoke create any index from Scott and revoke DBA from Scott. Because if we look, we can see that the target has grant DBA to Scott, but the source, which is our archive, does not. So again, the alter script would be to revoke the create index and revoke the DBA permissions. So we can easily be able to identify, single out the exact difference that we want to go ahead and generate a synchronization script for. And at this point, we can generate the synchronization script. Here it is. So in my case, I'm ready to go ahead and run this because I do want to bring these back in sync. So we'll execute. And there it is. The synchronization's been completed. So if we go back over to DBArtisan, right, refresh on the Scott user, you'll see that that permission was removed. If I look at my roles, the DBA role is now unselected. So again, quickly being able to identify any changes in the security in the users, both in the addition of users. Now, again, I could have dropped a user in DBArtisan. We would have detected that and given you the ability to recreate that user with the exact same permissions that the user had. We also found one that was added. We could drop it if we wanted to, but in this case, we went ahead and kept it. And then if there were any differences, we were able to find the alters and to be able to match that and adjust there. So again, I was able to bring my environments back in compliance. So another thing that we can do with DB Change Manager is to integrate this with source code control. Right? So we could take this synchronization script and put it into source code control right within the tool, right? Put it into Team Foundation, TFS, or CVS, any of the leading source code control repositories we can integrate with. So again, any of those files, any of those SQL files that were generated, get added directly to source code control. So you have that the history there and the locks. Now certainly you have it here as well. At any time we can come back in here and see the comparison results. So a lot of flexibility there. Now, before we hop over to configuration, I did want to take an opportunity here to show you a schema compare and do more than just the users. So in this case, let's just do something we all may have, and that's the Scott schema. Alright, so here I'm going to use a live source. So in this case, imagine what it would be like moving something from dev to test, from test to production. So in this case, I'm going to use one of my Oracle VMs, and I'm going to go ahead and use my other as the target, and I'm going to use 2 live data sources. If I look at the refinements, I just want the Scott owner. I'll go to my mapping. In this case, I really just want the schema types. If I go to my mapping, you'll see I have the schemas in both environments. Here are my options, the identical options that we saw with the security. Right? I'm going to exist in target only. I'm going to drop it. I'll leave the rest as they are. Notifications stay the same, and then here's the history. So let's save this. Now we can look here as this starts up. and we're going to compare the two live databases. Now, a little background on Change Manager. And Change Manager is a desktop tool, so all of the comparisons are being done on my desktop. So I just bring that up. We have some, well, not some, we have quite a few customers that are running it in the data center on a dedicated machine, taking advantage then of, number one, a larger machine with more memory, as well as removing the network as much as you can from the equation, having it as close to the databases as possible. So again, we're going to go out and connect to the databases and start bringing those back in. So we're going to let this run for a while, and we'll be back when the job's finished. So we're back now, and we can see that my schemas on my different environments certainly weren't as close to being alike as I thought. 45% match. So let's go ahead and look at the individual results again and see exactly what's happening here. We've got a couple creates, 2 drops, some alters, matched were 5. So here we can see that there's some alters, there's some drops, and there's some creates. So I'm going to leave out the packages, but on the others, I'm going to go ahead and generate a synchronization script. So again, it knows what database I need to be connected to because it knew which one was my target. So now I can go ahead and run that, and there we go. Synchronization is complete with the exception of those 2 packages. So again, really quickly able to find the results, right? Generate the synchronization script. I'm also able to generate a report at this point. So again, I mentioned in my email notification we have the ability to generate the report. We can do that here. We have different formats, certainly a comma separated value HTML as well as PDF. Looking at the report preferences, right, it gives you the ability to put your own logo there. The contents here, we can look at configuration, the data or the schema, right, and then some font. So that's about the security, and we're at the schema side of DB Change Manager. Now let's turn our attention now to the configuration side, and as we talk about those configuration parameters. So we have a couple ways of doing that. Again, you'll notice a very similar look and feel around DB Change Manager. Either we're working with schemas and the security side of things, or just schema objects, or configuration parameters. We're the very similar look and feel of how things are created. We mentioned here before we have our standard. So again, we can open this up at any time, look at the refinements. So at this point, I do have one that I want to define, and let's look at the one here that actually was the one that was in our PowerPoint. Remote login pass equals. We want that. Let's see. The default is none, so we'll go ahead and save that. Let's see if we have any that match that. Right. So at this point, let's do a configuration comparison job. We can create new. So again, we can use our live data source if we'd like, so we can compare one to many. All right, we can select a standard. So let's go ahead and select this image standard, the Oracle VM. Right, the target. And I'm going to add more targets to this. I'm going to bring my other Oracle database in. We'll go to the refinements. So again, we can see what version information, the core SQL properties as well. Now, I'm sure we're going to get some adjustments here, because we've got some things that are working and I'm going to adjust that right now, because I have a version 10 and a version 11 database. So let's go ahead and remote log it. Let's just bring this one in. Options, we can extract the DDL if we'd like. Again, notifications stay the same, and there's our history. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and kick off the job. Let it work. So we can see here, and again, not found, 25%, 0% were not found. Match 75. The remote login password file, I wanted it equal to none. On both of my instances, it was set to exclusive. So again, quickly find that for me. And TNS for 32-bit, we don't have that for my Oracle 10. And here's my other ones where the versions were not equal and these match. So again, a lot of flexibility with the compliance. Working with Oracle, you can get back in there and really define that standard and understand exactly. And as I showed here, looking at the overview, the one-to-many. So when you define that single Oracle image that you'd like, the standard configuration parameters, set it up once, point it to as many of those targets as possible, let it run, and let Change Manager do the work for you. So again, as we saw there, you can see the different settings. 75% match, as I would expected for my Oracle 11. I knew that it was exclusive, and I defaulted it to none. So looking at the way we can set up that standard. All right. So now I want to take some time here to get set up on a few things. One thing that I mentioned earlier about compliance. So when we look at that configuration comparison job, right, I can track that in my Compliance Explorer, track the results in the Compliance Explorer. So let's look at what that looks like. So here it is. We can see that, how that's set up there. Right, if we go back to our standard, go back to that refinement, and set that now to equal exclusive. We'll save the standard. Now let's go back to here. Again, we have our refinements, should be the same. And only that remote session is defined. There we go. Now let's go ahead and I'll run it again. And we'll see now that we have a 100% match because it equaled. Of course, my Oracle 10 is a little bit different, but we knew that going in. If I look at the compliance window then, right, at any time, I'm going to go ahead and save that change. We'll log off the standard. I could easily come into my Compliance Manager and start that up and go over to the version history and see exactly what's happened here. Now, this also pertains if the job is scheduled. So in this case, I could run it from I could generate the command line here. So we can see how the report should be run, the report output as well. And when we want to schedule it, and if we want to look at the report directory, I'll just set it in the root directory. Here, the script format can be a Windows, a BAT file, or an ANT file. Change Manager is a Windows application or Linux. It can run on both operating systems, so hence the ANT file. Here is the script to run this. We can copy to the clipboard if we'd like, or we can schedule the job. So again, this is our interface to go ahead and set that up to get the automation part of this, to set it and schedule it, let it run continually, use the Compliance Manager and drop those jobs in there so we can quickly go in there and understand that. So as I mentioned, the history here, we ran both of these from the workbench. If we wanted to run them from the command line, we'd still get these results right in here. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to step away. I want to get connected to my SQL Server VM and come right back. So give me a minute to get connected, and then we'll be right back. So we're back. So as part of that bonus, I wanted to show you how Change Manager can be used to set up brand new environments. So for this example, let's go ahead and connect to my SQL Server, and let's go ahead and do a new schema comparison job. And I'm going to go GIM to GIM staging DB. So my source is going to be my SQL Server source, and that's going to be where I'm going to get my GIM database. Now in the real world, I'd have another machine with my GIM staging, but for my environment here, I have the same physical machine. So in my refinements, we'll bring GIM as the source. I'll unselect server types, and then under my object refinements, here I can see the specific tables that I'm bringing over. I'm okay with that. Here is where I'll define that to equal GIM staging. There we go. We'll go to the options. These options are the same as we've seen before, so no need to go through anything there. Notifications are the same, and then history. So let's save the job, and let's go ahead and kick it off. So there we go, a 17% match. Let's show the individual results. So what matched? Let's see here. We've got 15 matches. All users. There's some views that were there as well. So those are the views that I did not delete to get it back to scheduling. So let's go ahead and we'll bring the crates over. Let's generate a sync script. Here's the synchronization script. Let's go ahead and kick that off. And here we go. So the script is finished. So my database now is back equaling. So let's go ahead and look at the database objects, the databases. Let's look at the GIM staging database, and let's confirm that there are indeed tables in that database. So there they are. Those are our tables. So we have our schema created. Now let's go ahead and take a look at bringing over the data. So DB Change Manager does indeed include a data compare. So let's go ahead and compare the GIM data. There we go. So the source is going to be, and the target will be the same databases. Let's go ahead, the same servers. The source will be GIM. The target will be GIM staging. Let's go to the options. Again, automatically synchronized. If we take this option, we have the ability then to do some data masking, because as we roll that in, we're going to truncate the table. Then we can recreate those, recreate the data rows, and truncate. Mask the data as we create those insert statements. The mapping, we need to check these pairs. If we select this, now for this example, we're just going to do office location. So let's go ahead and match on this column. There we go. So at this point, I'm ready to go ahead, save this. We could look at the notifications again, the history. We're going to go ahead and run this. And here's our 0% match, which is what we expected. We had no rows in it. So at this point, I'm going to select, and I'm going to move them all over to the target. Now if we had multiple, if there's data in both tables and they didn't match, I can select which rows I wanted to be moved back, but back and forth between the two, between the source and the target. So a lot of flexibility within DB Change Manager. So at this point, we want to generate the SQL script, and here is my wrapped in a transaction, my insert statements used to create the office location data. So again, a very simple example of the office location, but I wanted to highlight how easy it is with DB Change Manager to roll on through, stand up a new database, and again we're using SQL Server in this case, and then bring over the data from your existing database. So again, quickly getting the new environment set up. Now we did all this manually. We could have scheduled it, specified the automatic synchronization, and we'd have all this done for us. So when we come in Monday, we'd have our test environment or our QA environment all ready to go for our testers to work with. So again, using the automated approach. So that concludes the bonus section of the My Data U presentation. So just to wrap things up, we talked a little bit about security, right? How to manage the permissions and new users when they were added, and managing compliance, focusing on the database configuration and how to set up those standards and compare to those standards using that simple example in Oracle. Automation, talked about how we can set up these jobs, set them up once, run them often, using the command line, using the scheduler, getting email notifications. And lastly, that little bonus section we talked about, walking through there and setting up brand new database and moving over the objects, as well as being able to move over the data, and if needed, be able to mask some of that data. So I wanted to open up this time now. If there's any questions, please feel free to let us know. While you're doing that, though, I just want to give you a little overview of DB Change Manager, giving you the ability to quickly roll out database changes. Now, we had some specific examples we walked through, but I think you can take from those examples and see how we can work with propagating those changes from dev to test, and then from test to production, and be able to identify and roll up the specific changes, and track and report the differences both in the data, schema, configurations, and comply with database audit and reporting requirements. We didn't talk a lot about the reports that are generated, but certainly a very robust set of reporting options available within DB Change Manager. Data privacy, again, talking about the security, and then centralized cross-platform DBMS access. You saw me work with Oracle and SQL Server. What I didn't show was the ability to compare between and across the database platform. So again, because we are using a single user interface connecting to the multiple DBMSs, we do have the ability then to do that, to compare across. So again, and feel free, if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me via email at scott.walls@embarcadarrow.com. You can reach me on Skype as well if you'd like. It's just Scott Walls. This is my Skype ID. At this point then, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Scott asks, does DB Change Manager support Sybase SQL Anywhere?
Yeah, that was a good question, that one that we get often, is what specific platforms. And when I say Sybase, I probably should have clarified myself. It's Sybase ASE, Adaptive Server Enterprise, and that's the only version of, the only flavor of Sybase that we support, as well as Oracle, the traditional Oracle RDBMS, SQL Server, and IBM DB2 LUW, the mid-range version of IBM's DB2's tool.
Okay, Sebastian asks, can data compare and sync be used as a light ETL tool?
That's a great question, one that we get often. It can, right? I just want it, to be clear, it is a desktop tool, so we'll be, doing all that compare work on the desktop. So certainly, be smart about the sets of data, the volumes of data that you're working with. Certainly, don't think that it can, move over millions of rows, right? Certainly, but if you're smart about it, and if the key word there that I took was can be used as a light ETL tool. And I think if you keep to that and keep it light, then yes, it can.
I have a couple of questions, and I think you may have answered some of this as it relates to securing data and who has access to it, data masking, and so on. Is there a guideline for how long you have to keep logs of who has access to data, who's granting rights? Are the right columns masked and access restricted, or is that from legislation and industry and government requirements?
A great question, and I'm sort of ashamed to admit it, but I don't really know the answer to that. I'm sure most of our DBAs, our customers on the front lines, probably certainly know that all too well, what's required of them. But that's something that I need to research that. I need to know that. Yep.
But using the tools, there's nothing we delete. The user, the DBA, the developer would have to go and delete reports, for example, or would know how long they have to keep all of this around. Right.
Exactly, and the nice thing about, I mentioned it, during the product video and the demo, was that with DB Change Manager, the ability we can create the reports, but we also, all the synchronization files, and those are, sometimes the synchronization files are legitimate, and we don't want to synchronize. We're fine with a user being dropped or permissions being added, and we just let it roll and continue on. That was an acceptable change. But what we do with those synchronization scripts in the reports is we can store those off in version control and source code control systems, so you have another layer of security to keep track of those changes. So you can tell, on June 26, 2014, that user Scott W was given, update privilege to this table, and that may have been a acceptable change, one that was approved, but we now have a track. We can track that when it occurred.
I think it was mentioned in an earlier session that DB Change Manager and DB Optimizer, for that matter, are built on top of the Eclipse infrastructure, right? So you can hook in change management systems and other things.
Yeah, exactly. And just as DB Optimizer was built on the Eclipse framework, so was Change Manager. And there was a question here about the tools running on Linux, and Change Manager is one of our tools that can run on Linux as well.
What about DB Optimizer?
Yeah, Optimizer sure can. And I mentioned, when that question about the light ETL, we have customers that will put Change Manager on in a data center on a little bit more beefed up machine, and sometimes when they get inside a data center, the machine that's in there waiting for them is a Linux-based machine. So that fits really nicely with Change Manager being able to run on Eclipse or run on Linux. Well, the one thing, and after I did it, I continue to get questions and demo requests from some of our customers and prospects. But one of the things I always push and ask is what they're doing now, and it surprises me. Either the answer will be homegrown. We have some scripts that we run, or some they'll use just source code control on some DDL. And a lot of them don't have a formal process, and part of that formal process being some tool. Certainly, I'm going to suggest and promote DB Change Manager, but there's also other change management tools in the market. I just encourage you that if you don't have that process in place with a tool, then certainly research it and do the homework on it, because the tools, and we spend a lot of time in our R&D and making sure our products are up to speed and support the latest platforms, so you don't have to worry about it, and understanding what goes on within your database. And on that note, to understand that process, and I didn't talk about it during the demo, is that so other customers will just say, well, we have packaged applications, we don't have a need for Change Manager. Well, one of my best use cases that I'd ever heard was a customer that had Change Manager that had been capturing schema archives for their database, and the database just so happened to be supporting a packaged application. Well, the packaged application, they upgraded it to a new version and rolled it out, and there was a certain module that was incredibly slow, and they logged the issue with the vendor. The vendor said it has to be your network. Nothing's wrong with our application. The database is fine. And by the way, if you do anything to the application or the database, you run the risk of avoiding your warranty. The customer remembered he had the schema archive with the old version. He used that archive as the source, put the target as the new database with the upgraded version, found that there were 2 indexes missing. So quickly, very easily able to find that, and just responded to the vendor with a little snarky email attaching the DDL needed to create the indexes that they failed to create. and so that was my the story. When I heard that, it's like, okay, there's really not a situation where change management can't be beneficial to the organization.